Welcome back in, everyone. Rachel Haines is a speech-language pathologist who obtained her master's degree in communication sciences and disorders from the University of Central Florida. Rachel has worked with Orlando Health's Neuroscience Institute for Advanced Rehab since 2015. Rachel also serves as a speech-language pathologist with the Orlando Health ALS Multidisciplinary Clinic under Dr. Tohidi and Dr. Gutierrez. She specializes in neurological rehab, specifically ALS, MS, and Parkinson's disease. Her passion is working with persons living with ALS. She also developed an augmentative alternative communication program within Orlando Health to better serve the Central Florida area. Rachel's presentation today is Motor Speech Changes and ALS Support Across the Continuum. Thank you. Rachel? Technical difficulties.
All right, good morning. Thank you, Marixa, for that introduction. So as she said, I'm Rachel Haines. I'm a speech pathologist by trade. And today we're going to be speaking on one of my favorite topics, which is dysarthria or changes in speech with ALS. So my goal today is to educate and empower everyone that's living with ALS, as well as educate their caregivers and family of just all the supports that are available out there across the progression of the disease. And I have some amazing patients that you'll meet during our presentation as well through video and audio clips to help me kind of showcase that you don't have to lose yourself just because of a change or progression in speech. So we'll get into that as well. It's not advancing. Okay. There we go. Okay, so we'll kind of start with the basics of dysarthria. So dysarthria is really just a fancy term to describe this change in speech due to some sort of neurological condition. So we'll focus on ALS, of course, specifically today, because it does look a little bit different than maybe a dysarthria due to a stroke or a traumatic brain injury. And we'll go over some of the symptoms that you might hear a patient that is experiencing this change in speech in just a few minutes. So essentially, we know that ALS is a motor neuron disease. And with ALS, when we have progression of the disease, it's due to these motor neurons dying or kind of losing that communication that assists the brain to communicate with the muscles that we use for speech. So we see changes in the muscles we use for phonation, resonation, articulation, or precision of speech, as well as the respiratory system, which we'll talk about as well. Approximately 80% of people living with ALS will experience some sort of difficulty with their speech, not necessarily lose complete function, but we do know that at least 80% will experience some sort of change. So it is pretty widely experienced and known with the population. Onset, as you can see here, I don't know why I'm not touching anything, Leon, thank you. Okay, sorry guys. So the onset you can see is a pretty wide range here. So it can start anywhere from 33 months prior to diagnosis all the way up to 60 months after the diagnosis. It is more frequently one of the first symptoms that we see with a more bulbar onset ALS compared to dysphagia, which is changes in swallowing or difficulty swallowing. And one of the things that I don't feel is really talked about is just how much change in speech or loss of speech can lead to social isolation. So I really work closely with our social worker and encourage that mental health counseling as well. and try to empower my patients to use the technologies that are available for them to try and limit the degree of social isolation, if not eliminate it altogether. All right, let's see if this works this time. Yay. Okay, so I'm not going to really break down this graphic for purposes of today's conversation, but I did think it just really highlighted well the different symptoms that you see on the far right of the screen under clinical signs, of just the things that we might hear or notice with a person that might be experiencing some form of change in speech or dysarthria. So the three main types of dysarthria that we see with ALS are what is called flaccid, spastic, or a mixed dysarthria, which is really just any combination of symptoms or clinical signs for flaccid and spastic. So some of the things that we might hear or perceive from the person that is experiencing this change, maybe slow labored speech. We might also notice like a strained or tight vocal quality, particularly at the end of a word, phrase, or sentence. We might also notice kind of more of like a hypernasal speech, or if you've had a cold before and your nose is stuffy, you can kind of get that nasality to your voice. And then sometimes too, we have air that escapes from our nose, and we can hear that on certain sounds. We also have imprecise productions of specific sounds. Typically, I know there's a few patients of mine in here. You guys have read the bamboo passage that's standardized for us to assess a lot of these clinical signs that we're looking for to diagnose the type of dysarthria. It has a lot of P's and B's that use a lot of breath support. So those are sounds that we're really looking for as well to look at your respiratory function. Sometimes patients come to me and they say, I sound like I'm drunk. So drunk speech is something that's used a lot to describe that slurred, kind of sloppy quality, because the muscles can't really keep up with the rapid movement as we're speaking. So those are just some of the conversations that we start to have to figure out what's going on and what area of motor neuron is affected, upper versus lower, or a combination of the two. And something, too, that I work closely with respiratory is noticing any shortness of breath. So we kind of overlap a little bit there of addressing the respiratory function. We're going to talk about some different supports moving forward for all of these different symptoms. So we'll start with voice preservation. And any of my patients can tell you that they get a really big soapbox feel from me when they come and see me about this. It's not for everybody. Not everyone likes to spend the time to do it, but it's my job to educate and empower you guys to know what is available, and the technology's pretty wonderful these days. So there's two main types. With message banking, which is shown on the left, you're essentially just recording individual or personalized phrases. You can capture songs like singing happy birthday. I've had patients capture reading like a bedtime story to a young child or a grandchild. I have one particular patient in mind. She has a service animal, so she was preparing for that and was able to capture all of her commands, because animals don't necessarily recognize a more synthesized version of your voice, so they might not respond. So we kind of sit down and have some conversation about what is important for the patient. So essentially, message banking is capturing those individual personalized messages that can be used later on as a specific recording. So if someone records, "I love you," the dedicated device, which we'll talk about towards the end of today or this morning, it recognizes, hey, this person recorded it, and it's going to play it in your natural speech versus the synthesized kind of Siri voice that's built into the device. And then on the flip side, so on the right side is voice banking. It is a bit more time consuming. There is some new technology coming out, and I think will continue to come out with all the AI that's kind of come about in the last couple of months here too, so I'm excited to see what will happen with that. But we're creating basically your own Siri, your own Alexa. There are pluses and minuses to both. With message banking, you can capture that natural kind of emotion behind your voice, the intonation, that rise and fall that we have naturally. With voice banking, it does come out a bit more monotonous in terms of not really having the emotion and naturalness to the voice, but it is still clearly your voice instead of having to use Joe or Lisa, whoever it is built into the device already. So it's a wonderful option for those that are interested in it. The programs listed here, Acapella and Model Talker, are two of the probably the main ones I feel that are used for the voice banking process. And I utilized some resources with Team Gleason, the ALS Association, and other organizations to help cover the finances for patients. So I've never actually had a patient have to pay out of pocket for the voice banking process, and it can be easily $1,000 plus to create this voice. So there's some wonderful tools out there. So I highly, highly encourage you to ask your team or your speech therapist, or come find me later today and I can give you more information on this. And another thing too, I've had patients double dip. So it's a term that Team Gleason has kind of deemed possible. So some of my patients have sat down, they started message banking, and we have like 500 messages all of a sudden. So instead of having to spend another 15 hours doing your voice banking process, we take all those high quality recordings, and then the company creates your own synthesized voice from the work you've already done, which is a wonderful option because it seems daunting when I say 500 plus, but it's very doable as you get started. There are some parameters with that in terms of you can't use singing, so happy birthday songs or holiday songs aren't usable, but anything from 3 to 8 seconds in terms of recordings are usable. Okay, and so this is a wonderful patient of mine that you're gonna meet a couple of times today in this presentation. He has done voice banking with Acapella, and when he plays poker with his buddies, and I got permission to show this picture of all his buddies and the patient, he uses his Acapella voice. So we'll play this audio clip so you can kind of hear, at first there's just kind of general talking with the group, but you'll hear that Acapella voice banking voice come in that is this individual himself. Maybe.
Especially the same day that they went over there yesterday, we had.
This year is the 10th anniversary of our poker game, affectionately known as the Texas Hold'em Supper Club. We have a reward for high hand of the night, as well as the bad beat of the night.
Holy moly.
We also collect money for charity each week, which we donate to needy causes around our community.
Especially the same day that they went over there yesterday, we had.
So you can see.
You guys have learned a lot about Texas Hold'em since we started.
Who's missing one?
Nobody's missing one over here.
And there's one.
Oh, that's the
there's one over there.
There's one over here.
That's got 4 buy-ins over there.
Everyone makes the same mistakes each week, but I can't seem to find a smarter group of players. You know, if I found a smarter group, they won't as easy to beat. Everybody loves it when you go all in.
All in. Good luck, all in.
He's bluffing. You can tell by the way his face gets all wrinkled. Actually, his face is always wrinkled.
Okay. I think that was it. So I love this clip just because it really showcases that you can still do the things that you love and enjoy, and that bring you joy, yes, there's been a big change in your speech and it's communicating in maybe an unnatural way at first, but with this particular patient, when we first started working together, a bit hesitant to utilize some of these technologies that he spent so much time completing. But I just encourage kind of getting comfortable with it so you can sit in this type of setting and be okay with the slight silence of kind of waiting for that response to come through when he's using a text-to-speech type application for this voice itself. And that his friends are so welcoming of it as well. So it just really showcases that social side of things that's so important with what can be a very isolating diagnosis. Okay, there we go. Oh, technology doesn't like me today. Okay, we'll see if it stays. So with voice preservation, kind of continuing with that message and voice banking process, there are some really cool things that are coming out with a iOS 17 update. So this is Apple specific, but I believe that there should be more updates coming out and other major companies kind of following suit to make it more accessible. So the iOS update is going to include something called live speech and personal voice. So it's going to be an option to actually bank your voice. So that voice banking process that I spoke briefly about 2 slides ago that can take anywhere from 15 to 20 hours with iOS can now take about 15 minutes. So it's going to be so easily accessible for patients. I am hesitant though, I don't know all of the logistics of it in terms of, okay, yes, we're doing it on an Apple product, so will this carry over to a Windows-based communication device in the future? So I have some emails out to try and get some more information so I can help my patients better. But I wanted to share it because it's new and innovative and so far less time consuming, because I think that's really the biggest barrier for patients right now is how much time. When I say it could easily take this many hours, it's like, oh, no, I don't think so, not right now. So this voice will integrate into the phone as well as video calls through FaceTime, which I think is a wonderful thing to have. And a company called Proloquo that does assistive technology for communication devices, they're actually the ones teaming up with Apple to make this happen, which is pretty awesome. And then also too, with the middle picture here, that's kind of just a snapshot of what voice banking looks like. So it's scripted phrases that you read out loud. The device records it and then kind of gives you an output of good, bad, poor in terms of quality, and those voices and scripted messages is what creates that Siri or Alexa-like voice, or synthesized voice is what you'll hear us say as well. And then you use that voice with a feature called live speech that will be available with an iOS 17 update. And I don't know even where the updates are right now. My phone's way outdated. I think 16, thank you. I was gonna say, I think my phone was yelling at me. I'm still on 15, so I'm like way off, and that's probably why it doesn't like me right now. So again, I think that with AI technology too, that we're going to really start to see these big companies come out with some pretty great and time-saving updates. But if you do pull up this update with Apple to read more about it, it's for MacBook, iPads, and iPhones. So you could do it on any of the 3 pieces of technology, and they have really gotten some wonderful information and have educated themselves on ALS specifically. So these updates are really designed for people living with ALS, which is wonderful. Okay, so let's talk about what can we do across the spectrum of the diagnosis. One of the things that I love to utilize with my patients that's been kind of newer research is expiratory muscle strength training. I know my patients have definitely heard about it, but definitely if you haven't, ask your team, ask your speech pathologist and respiratory therapist if it's appropriate for you. There's a great research article by Emily Plowman, I believe it was through Gainesville, that came out with this pretty groundbreaking research to show that there is some strengthening that we can do to a certain extent early on in the disease process. So essentially with this, you blow into a device against resistance that's calibrated to your specific respiratory needs. I encourage it even if you're not experiencing what we consider bulbar symptoms, so speech, respiratory, or swallowing. That's really when we want to start, when you're not having any involvement at all, because there does come a point in time where it's not appropriate. It is considered contraindicated is a word we would use in terms of your respiratory function. So I work very closely with our RTs, our respiratory therapists, and I'm constantly looking at the pulmonary function test numbers that you guys are likely familiar with as well, just to make sure that it remains an appropriate strength training exercise for you. In the learning lab, we have a couple of the devices just so you can look at them. So feel free to come by. It's the first table on the right. Come visit us. It will be myself and another speech pathologist from down south, Brianna. So come and ask us questions if you have more. And then also I love to do some range of motion, just kind of more passive stretches of the muscles we use for speech and for swallowing. There are some active ones as well that we can give you. Keeping these muscles in motion, we never want to say refrain from speaking, but you'll hear us talk a lot about energy conservation, which I'll talk about in just a second. But these range of motion, just good stretches. My team sees tongues out all the time in our office, side to side, up and down, lips moving, sounds coming out. They don't come running anymore when they hear voices go up and down. So it's a fun time to kind of go through these. And then, like I said, dysarthria management. So really just a blanket term for strategies for speech. Maybe over-articulating your sounds. So we work with patients closely to try and get them to emphasize each individual sound instead of kind of scanning over the sounds like we tend to do in the English language. Facing your communication partner, so kind of rearranging your environment to make it more easy, an easier time to communicate face-to-face, reducing background noise best we can, turning off the radio in the car if you have something to say because you can't necessarily face your partner in that instance, or attempting to get young kids to be a little more quiet in the home when you're trying to speak with them, things like that. And then also establishing a context if you really are having more difficulty communicating naturally, using your natural oral speech. Just gives the communication partner a slight background to maybe fill in the gaps instead of having to ask you to repeat yourself, which can get not only fatiguing, but frustrating as well. And then we kind of tend to shut down as humans and just don't communicate. And that's not what I want to happen for my patients. We also talk a lot about pacing or breath breaks. So probably taking more breath breaks than I am up here, talking a mile a minute, kind of naturally slowing that pace down and maybe doing 3 to 4 syllables versus 5 to 10 syllables on a breath. So just kind of retraining, making it as natural as possible. And something that's important to have as a conversation, as a unit or a family as a whole, is identifying, do you want them to speak for you? Is that frustrating or is that okay? I have patients that they're fine with it if you finish their sentence or you anticipate their needs without them having to communicate. But then I have some patients where that is, they want to be able to do it themselves. They know that they can in some way or fashion, whether it's through gestures, picture exchange, communication devices, typing it out, or just taking a little bit extra time to communicate it using natural speech. So have that conversation, because most likely your loved ones and caregivers are finishing your sentence for you from a good place in their heart, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't cause frustration for you living with the disease. And then voice amplification. So it is kind of like a microphone like I'm using today. There's lots of different types. They range from $20 to $500. It really just depends on your needs. And this is wonderful for those that maybe still have great precision of speech, meaning your speech is clear, but your respiratory system is most affected, which reduces how loud and boisterous, how well we can be heard. But these are not designed for this big room like this microphone is. They're designed for more one-on-one, like intimate conversations. So you can adjust the volume to your environment. So you might be able to up it just a little bit if you're going out for a meal or a social setting, or even a stroll outside where you have the cars and trucks kind of moving through. But then if you're in a more private, intimate kind of room or watching a show or something like that, you can bring the volume down to support you. So there's some wonderful options out there to try as well. And now we're going to spend some time on augmentative and alternative communication, or AAC. You might also hear the words speech generating devices, or SGD. They're all interchangeable, just different terms that we use, fancy terms to describe the technology. So augmentative meaning adding to someone's speech, whereas alternative meaning to replace someone's speech. We're going to start with our low-tech systems. So these are typically systems that are not battery operated and are more easily accessible from a financial standpoint. They're also typically way more portable. We have some examples at the Learning Lab today as well you can look at. You can take them to the beach. I've made laminated boards like you see on this page for a patient to use in the shower during a bath, so they can get wet. And they're lightweight, so you're not going to fatigue as easily. So sometimes the patients want to be in charge of their communication, of course, and these are typically more easily accessible and can go around with you. The one on the top left is really just a writing tablet. There's another fancy term called boogie board that you might hear your speech pathologist recommend, but basically you write on it, you press a button, and it erases it for you. So it's a great option instead of having to carry around a bunch of papers or like a notebook. And then these are just examples of different boards. There's an ABC board that you see in the bottom left corner there, and then the two on the right are more picture-based systems. And it really is patient preference, but we also have to look at, is there any cognitive involvement, or what we see often sometimes with ALS is more of a frontotemporal dementia-like presentation, and so the text-based boards aren't usually effective for that patient. They need that picture exchange instead. And then this slide just, again, highlights some different options for you. The one on the left is accessible through the Boston Children's Hospital ALS clinic, and you can customize it yourself or have your therapist customize it. And you kind of flip through it, so it's more of like a flip communication board, but it's wonderful and organized based on categories that are real functional. I took a snapshot of kind of food and drinks. So you can put what your patient prefers. Like for this one, there's some fun stuff like gin and tonic and ice cream and kind of your variety. So we got to get creative and still get the patient what they prefer. And then the one on the right just highlights, again, more text-based communication of wants and needs and daily activities. And then with more higher tech communication, so high tech is really just anything that's going to be more battery operated, needing charging. They have their place in terms of where you're at with the progression, but with a lot of the apps that are available, they can go right on the person's smartphone. So I might have a patient that's really just experiencing more what we call those bulbar symptoms, again, speech, respiratory, or swallowing symptoms, versus lower extremity or upper extremity symptoms. So they're maybe still very active and walking around, playing golf, whatever it might be, but they need the support for communication. Holding like a 15, 20-pound communication device isn't going to be functional for this patient. So we have to get smart, right? And we have to conserve energy too. So other ways are through these apps that are available. These are just snapshots of different apps, but you can search. There's so many that are free. You can just search text-to-speech on your smartphone or tablet and find one that you prefer and work with your therapist and your team to customize it or find the right one. There are some that you can purchase, several dollars up to hundreds of dollars. But there's good ones that are free too. So I try to start with the free stuff first. There's time and place for spending money as needed. The two on the right are iPad specific, and I can give you more information on those. They're through a company called Tobii Dynavox, but they are just iPad specific for right now, not even on an iPhone. And then here's my friend again. So he was using his a cappella voice, which is the voice banking with his poker friends, but he prefers to use his text-to-speech when he communicates via phone. So this is him. He's a golfer as well. So this is him making a phone call to his favorite golf place, and you'll be able to hear that text-to-speech communication and showcasing the independence that you can still have versus having to ask your caretaker to make that phone call for you.
Mallory Hill Golf Shop, this is Kim. How can I help you?
Yes, I would like to make a tee time around 2 p.m. today.
How many golfers will there be?
Just one, thank you.
I have 2 tee times around 2 p.m., one at 2:08 and one at 2:16. Which would you like?
Are there any other golfers at those times?
Yes, 3 men at 2:08 and 3 ladies at 2:16.
I'll take the tee time at 2:16 with the ladies. They're a lot more fun.
Great. What's your ID number?
My ID is 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
Thank you. That's John Wilson, right?
Yes. Oh, by the way, I'll have a spectator with me.
Okay, just let the starter know when you get here.
Well, she's not really a spectator, but more a critic of my golf swing.
I'm sorry, sir. We can't help you with that. We're a golf shop, not a marriage counselor.
Too bad. Thank you very much. See you at 2:16 p.m.
Thank you for calling Mallory Hill. Goodbye.
So you can see that you're still able to capture your personality by making those jokes. That's very much this patient. But also maintaining that level of independence for yourself. Again, I think this might have been me pushing it as homework for this particular patient, maybe, of saying you need to go home and practice, get used to utilizing it so you can make these phone calls, because he was having his spouse make a lot of the phone calls and would kind of just hand the phone over. But he had the technology, and I knew that he could do it. And so this just kind of showcases just what it can do for you. And then with kind of some of the high-tech stuff continued, there are other apps that are available that are also free from a financial perspective.
and use alternative access, which you'll hear about during my lecture, but also when my colleague speaks after me, she'll speak a bit more on alternative access to these pieces of equipment or technologies. There's lots that are out there. I put one on there just to show it. It's called Sesame Enable. It was originally designed for all sorts of neurological conditions, not just ALS, but also spinal cord injuries and things like that. Through COVID, the company did unfortunately go out of business, but they were able to maintain access to these programs for free, so you can still access them online. The company and support itself is just no longer present, to my knowledge. I use it for some patients. It uses head tracking, which isn't always widely recommended with ALS because we can see weakness of the neck muscles and into the shoulder where we might have some head drop going on. So we don't want to overuse this muscle by making these big movements. But it has its place, and it's also accessible on phones and computers, which can be good access for some patients that are experiencing no weakness of these muscles in that moment. And then we'll get into more dedicated communication devices. So these aren't all of them, but I have kind of the three maybe more largely known companies with ALS here, but I won't mention the names. And they just have a lot of different features. They all are eye gaze accessible, that you can either get right away if we can justify it, or that we add on and later on if there's progression of the upper extremities and lower extremities, making it difficult for you to touch the screen using your body itself. So it just tracks the pupil movement, and we can do one eye or both eyes. So lots of different devices here. And the primary goal, of course, is communication, but there's a secondary goal for these devices that can actually control your environment. And so I'll have some videos in a minute that kind of showcase different things that the eye gaze systems can do outside of communication, and what our options are for that in terms of either getting it funded or purchasing out of pocket, so you can continue doing the things that bring you joy in life. And like I had mentioned, my colleague will be speaking a little bit more on some of the access methods, but this is just a list of access methods to these more dedicated communication devices. The main ones that I feel that we use the most with ALS are going to be the eye gaze that I had mentioned, tracking pupil movement, because the eyes are generally not affected with any disease progression. And then manual or touch, and that could even be using a stylus or some sort of connected to an arm brace too, if we still have good range of motion forward and strength to touch the screen. So I work a lot with our OT, PT, and seating specialists to try and figure out what is the best option now and in the future for my patients getting these devices. So this is the first video of another wonderful patient friend of mine that graciously gave some time to create a couple of videos. So he is still ambulatory, he's still able to walk around. He has more progression of his upper extremities, and he still works full-time. So when he came to me, we were trying to figure out what other access method could work for him so he could maintain his work. And his speech is essentially unaffected at this point. And so we looked at different eye gaze systems. You'll see at the top as the video plays that he uses dragon dictation still too. But there are some features he was unable to access easily with dragon dictation, but was having so much more trouble using his hand mouse as well. So he got eye gaze for his work computer. So you see here, he's just kind of navigating the screen. That circle is the computer control circle that's activating all of these things. So he's gonna bring up an email, and he's
he is a better user at it than I think I am. He's a rock star with it. And these are all your different options that come up that your mouse does for you. But he's doing all of this with his eyes instead. And he's going to turn on his dragon dictation. And he's sending an email to himself here, and you'll hear his voice in a second. And that's just kind of making the selection more precise, is what he's doing there. Oh. He's speaking that part, the place order that's going in. And so you can really see that it takes a lot of practice to kind of work through using eyes for your computer in place of your mouse. And he definitely needed some of the tech, even past me. I was contacting tech support with just some of the more involved activities that he's needing to do because it's for work and not just kind of getting on to navigate, like a simple email like he was showing here. And although he is still able to use his dragon dictation, he's demonstrating that you can still construct that email fully using your eyes with the on-screen keyboard. And it's just your typical QWERTY keyboard like we're used to on our phones, but you can alternate it to an ABC if that's easier. I'll let it run for a little bit longer, and then I'll show the next one he sent me as well. And you can see at the top, too, how the letters or words are changing. So it's your predicted text. So as the device or software gets to know you, it kind of can predict what words you typically use, just like our phones can. And so that kind of increases the efficiency of typing out the message as well. So there he goes and uses that predicted text to finish his word. And he has some really tiny targets. So he's a rock star at using his eyes for sure. But he'll go in there and open up the message, I believe. And again, I got permission from all these awesome patients to showcase their work. So he's going to minimize the screen. Bringing up the Excel. So I'll show this for just a second as something slightly different and a bit more complicated as well from an eye gaze perspective. And it blew my mind watching it because I'm not an Excel person. It makes no sense to me, but he can do it with his eyes, so I was pretty impressed.
And he'll turn on his dragon dictation here as well.
7/5/23. Tab. Mic placement order for 10 monitors.
Perfect. So you can see that he's really utilizing all sorts of technology to ensure that he can still remain in the workplace environment, because that's what he wants to do, and he's still able to do it. His company's also been phenomenal with the support as well to allow this to happen, but he's using the dragon dictation or voice dictation, he's using eye gaze, and he is still able to access the hand mouse slightly, but it was just becoming a bit more fatiguing. So then I'll have you guys play the next video for me. And in the next video, it's showing a slightly different navigation on his computer, where he's also using a PowerPoint presentation, but still using his eyes to navigate through because he's unable to click forward through the presentation. So again, he's hitting those really tiny targets, but doing a really good job. And kind of navigating his work website as well. And using the snipping tool, so this was something we had to problem solve because I had never had a patient that needed to use this with eye gaze before, so it took some trial and error and communication with the company that provided the eye gaze for his computer. But he'll snip this and then he's able to put it into like a presentation or whatever he might need. And so we'll go ahead and move forward for time's sake. And I don't know if I have time to play this, probably not from what I'm being looked at. But I'd love to play this. This is another amazing patient who his one thing was painting. Painting and communication were his two things that he told me from day one when he came to clinic that he cannot lose the ability to do in some form or fashion. So he paints with his eyes, and he does phenomenal work. I have some art. Okay, I'm being told by Marixa I can show it. And I'm unable to fast forward through, so I don't know if we could even start like halfway through it, maybe, just to kind of show what he can do. And the PT that works with him would yell at him for his positioning in the chair in that top left corner, but I'll let him slide because he made the video for me. But all of this, so it's the same software eye gaze that the previous amazing eye gaze user was doing for work, but he's utilizing it with a digital paint program that he found for his Windows computer when he lost function of his upper extremities. And so I'll kind of show like a couple of things where he's making it, but then I'm wondering too if we could show like at the end result of just this masterpiece he creates with his eyes, with the trees. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. He painted something, and I have it up in my office that he graciously donated to me. So he's, anyone with our clinic knows who I'm talking about, but I won't say his name. I don't know if he's here today. I haven't seen him or not, he and his daughters. But he does some awesome work, so I just really wanted to showcase kind of just the broad spectrum of what you can do with the technology, from continuing in your workplace to give yourself that sense of need and fulfillment, right? But also the socialization of my first patient who's making phone calls for himself and still engaging in his poker games with his buddies, and then to continuing with a passion of paint. And this is the one thing this patient just could not lose. So we're making it happen. And so finally, very briefly, and then my colleague will come up and continue the conversation, there's really just a big role of all disciplines working together. My team, with my OT, Tracy, and physical therapist and seating specialist, Robin, who's unable to be with us today, but we cross gray lines. We all work very tight-knit, and you can see here listed that we should be crossing lines. It's important to work on positioning and access and mobility and communication with the same goal in mind, but different approaches. So I doubt I have time for questions, but come find me. I'll be in the learning lab. I talk a lot, so I'm sorry, guys. But thank you so much for your time. And I think Tracy will be coming up next. Merix is coming. Thank you.